Okay. It looks like we're live. Is everyone alive?
Yep.
No,
Okay.
I think
More or less.
I can drink tea, so I must be alive.
Yep.
Good. Well, let me introduce myself, and then I think we agreed you guys would each introduce yourselves as well. I'm Tim Jorgensen, director of a program called Viking Connection with Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, which is in Minnesota, home of the great Hjemkomst ship. And this is the second of a 6-part series for discussions and questions about Viking Age topics. And our first one was about leatherwork, and this one is about Viking Age foodways. So we have both Daniel and Kari here to join us for this discussion, and I'll let them each introduce themselves in order of the lineup on the screen here. It looks like we can start with Daniel.
All right. My name is Daniel. These days I usually call myself a culinary archaeologist. My background is medieval Viking Age archaeology and experimental archaeology first and foremost. I've been working with food and food history, food archaeology since the early 90s in one way or another. Not just Viking Age, but also medieval foods, Renaissance food. And I started looking into the practical ways of reconstructing Viking Age food through experimental archaeology when I started doing a PhD on Viking food. So since then, I've been working on looking into the food, and I produced a cookbook. Make some. You can see it now. So this is my cookbook. And I've been doing quite a lot of workshops and lectures for reenactment groups, for museums. Yeah, over to Kari.
Yeah, I'm Kari. I am not an archaeologist or a historian. I work at 2 different Iron Age museums. I do a lot of practical work with prehistoric and historic food. I run a small project called the Viking Food in Vestfold, which is supported by the local council. I'm also part of the board of an umbrella organization organizing all the local Viking associations in Vestfold and Telemark in Norway. And of course, food is part of what I do there as well. So I came to this through ending up in the kitchen at fighting events all the time. So I started out with trying to figure out how you can actually cook for lots of people with just some pits for fire and some old pots.
And have you worked with each other before?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, a few times. Well, I didn't say I'm from Sweden, so it's not that far to Norway. So I've been to events which Kari has arranged. We have been to events together that's sort of been arranged in different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Most exotic, no.
We went to Denmark, for instance.
Denmark, yeah.
The sausage stick event.
Yes.
And also I helped out Daniel when he was getting pictures for his cookbook. So you can see my hands and my stomach a lot in the book.
Yeah, I think you're the sausage lady in the book.
Yes, definitely.
Sausage fingers.
Okay, yes.
And with a very blunt knife, I must say. Chopping all that meat.
Well, that's good to hear. I've got the book and seen the pictures and made the sausages a few different times, some with Daniel. And I guess that can serve as a segue to our next question, and that is the food itself and how you interpret, how you come up with what you decide to call Viking food. I've opened a menu in a Mexican restaurant up here, and it says Viking burrito. And
wow, that's interesting.
Potatoes in it, and
of course.
So how do you interpret the food from the Viking Age and come up with recipes or ideas of what to feed your fellow Vikings?
Ooh, I'm not sure if Kari should start. I think we're doing more or less the same methodology. I usually start with experimental archaeology. So it's sort of testing the material culture in a proper environment. Kari, I think you do something similar because you're doing lots of
right, because you can afford to fail. My
yes.
bottom is usually having to feed people, and preferably them not getting too disgusted or falling over dead or anything like that.
That's true. So, well, that's sort of a later part, and we end up there anyway. But yes, I usually have the luxury of failure.
Yeah.
So, but I think we start with, because I'm looking at the material culture, the finds of ingredients, and see how they combine. How can you cook the raw materials that were existing at the time using the material culture at the time? That's sort of the starting point in my laboratory. And
and I also add context.
Yes.
Because even though you know something about the ingredients available, they will be very different from season to season, region, status, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, of course. Yes, regional status, everything would influence how you combine it. Then I also use sort of the next step is using what little written sources they have, sort of contemporary or next to contemporary sagas. We have some contemporary Anglo-Saxon writings about medical recipes, which can be used. Later medieval recipes can be used for getting an idea on how to use the cooking implements. For instance, what things would you use with a spit? With a spit? How will you think about boiling sauces, boiling meat?
And I also look at what we know of historic but pre-industrialized food and rural agrarian culture in Norway, because a lot of that is very, very old-fashioned, and we have sources going back quite a ways. But of course, we need to know what we have to remove, the things that really are not relevant at all. But some things go back a long time, much longer back than the Viking Age, like the use of cultured milk.
Yes, it's something. Well, sometimes you can use the traditional food. Sometimes you have to think about how things changed.
Yeah, and you definitely have to think about how things change, but they can be a starting point, giving you ideas about the ingredients and how they were used, because they would have pretty much the same plant material, animals, the same cooking implements, and so on.
Yeah, but for instance, yes. So, for instance, milk is probably one of the things where you can find quite a lot of similarities.
Mm.
Grains would be a bit different because there you've got this big change of, for instance, mills.
Yeah,
And
I have a
change.
lot of things that you need to take into consideration, and I'm planning to order them according to century.
Yes.
So watermills would be a big one, and of course, in the Viking Age, you had slaves, for instance. Well, there's a whole range of things that you need to take into consideration.
Yeah,
also, taxation, producing for sale, things that mostly would happen after the Viking Age, but they would affect food production and food use. Like people would, to a great extent, stop eating their own butter because butter was too valuable to be eaten. You would pay your taxes with it or use it to buy things.
Yeah, it's even actually it's later on in Sweden that you have a Swedish king who's borrowing lots of money from the Hanseatic League, and he pays off with butter. So butter is very important. Cheese, the same thing. So that changes how you make it and how you use it. And bread, mills, grains, same thing. So yes, you have lots of things changing. So yeah, so that's this part, and also tapping into what Kari said about cooking for a large group of people. because that's the next part. When I tried several times using experimental archaeology, you have to think about the practicality. Sort of how does it work? Not just cooking for myself, cooking for a group of people, cooking in context, cooking in a sort of kitchen context.
Also, what compromises you need to make.
Yes. And I mean, we had a great experience with that when we were making the cooking pit we were in Trondheim at an event. Me and Kari worked together. And we did a full feast out in the middle of nowhere using Viking Age equipment to feed 80 people. And there we had to think about how you could use the methods practically to feed a lot of people. So there it was very obvious that making a cooking pit and preparing the day before was really helpful.
Yeah, I can imagine preparation for large crowds is a bit of work.
Yes, if you don't have any where to keep things cold, you don't have any modern cookery, everything like that. So we have to work together quite a bit with that one.
We do have 4 questions already in the sidebar here. And if you guys are okay with it, we can throw them in now rather than try to weave them into the timeline here. Why is it important to reinvent Viking food nowadays? And that's followed by a question, what about salt? And I think those can almost go together. What can we learn about salt as an example of reinventing Viking food nowadays?
By saying something about salt. We're not quite sure if salt was imported and in what quantities really. But I have been looking into old ways of conserving fish and meat, and most of them use a tiny bit of salt, not for the actual conservation, but to control the bacterial growth, so you get the right bacteria, so the food will get fermented and not go bad and make you sick and potentially die. So it is likely that some salt has been imported, and it's mentioned in very early diplomas. Also, there is this story about someone in Iceland getting their head salted.
Yes, and there's also one, I think, in HCSCC, where his uncle, or I'm not sure who it is in the family, is going traveling and selling stockfish to England and getting salt, among other things, back. So that describes an import of salt. The salt, of course, has been produced in Europe for quite a long time. So it's there is an established salt production in Europe for a long time before the Viking Age. So yes, there was an import. I don't think it was. I would say it was an import, but it wasn't very big. It wasn't salt to taste. But to the question also, why is it important, or why do you have to reinvent the Viking Age cuisine? Well, for me, it is a way of presenting history. It's a very good way of getting to know history, to present history, to learn about, everyday life. I think everyday life is more important than the wars and warriors and kings. Another important part about food is part of everything. Food is part of politics, ideology, religion. So you can find aspects of the whole sort of society in food.
And everyone eats. So inviting people to taste historical food is always a good opener in introducing them to the past and realizing that things can be very different. Their expectations are not necessarily the ones that cover what it was actually like. People tend to think that in the Viking Age you will have these big chunks of meat that people will be sitting there and chewing on, and the juices and fat would drip down their clothing into their beard and so on. And it's It's interesting both to see their reaction when you present to them that the food is very different and it's tasty, but it's nothing like they imagine, because most people imagine it's like modern traditional food.
Yeah.
It's not. There are no mashed sweets or anything like that.
And also, I mean, and at the same time as it's a very good way of presenting history, it's a very good way of distorting history if you want to.
Mm.
So you can, if you make it modern, if you do something, it's very easy to tweak it into something modern, and you distort it instead. But yeah, I think it's important from that part. I wouldn't say, well, it is, of course, it is good to look at, if you look at the sort of environment, it is good to look at seasonality in food. Perhaps eating a bit less meat than grains and milk produce, and to reduce the meat part of our meals could also be good.
Or at least eat local foods. Don't eat
Yeah, that is well.
that come from halfway the world around.
Yeah. So look a bit differently at look at about what we eat in a bit different eyes. So that could be a good way of good reason to look into food from older periods.
And also, food is part of history, just the same as any other part of history. So if you're going to portray any piece of the past, then you should do it faithfully and do it as accurately and authentically as you could. And why shouldn't that apply to food?
Yeah, and also, quite honestly, it's fun.
It is fun. I think for living history and those of us that get together and dress up and do these events, the cooking area is always the get together point, and especially after the public leaves at some of these events, and that's where we get together for the evening meal, and that goes on past midnight very often.
Yeah.
So it's a huge social component, not just for learning about history, but for keeping our relations alive nowadays. Boy, we have a lot of questions. I would say over 20 in the last 10 minutes here. We'll try to get to them. A lot of them are about specific ingredients, and maybe we can talk about ingredients all together as more of those come in later. I did want to check in here from Johan Johansson as a question. In the age of sustainable living, would you say that Viking Age cooking and food culture would be a sustainable way of eating?
It would, at least in these parts, because all those things are still grown, or you can go out and fish them or pick them. So yes.
Yeah, well, and also if you follow seasons, of course, that would be a bit more sustainable. And as I said, I think there will be a bit less meat consumption if you look at the full year. It's a bit different during the Viking Age. I would say you would eat more meat during certain periods of time and less others. So I would say that you would have a bit, because we eat quite a lot of meat today. That would influence also the sustainability.
Right.
And yeah, all the cooking methods, I'm not sure if that's always so sustainable using live fires. And it's and if we talk about local environments, the cooking personnel is not really getting the good end of it because you're standing in the smoke or sitting.
I was thinking this morning how there's probably a little bit of smoke in everything, almost everything.
Yeah, that's true. I would say that smoke and acidity are two of the main tastes, sort of flavors to the food.
I wanted to look a little bit at more about how we're dealing with food, since I work for a museum here in Minnesota, and travel around as much as I can to Viking events around the world and see how they're handling food and all the crafts really. And you see some differences, but for reenactment today for the food demonstrations. What are you seeing that's going right, and what could use some change? I know that maybe our modern tastes and approach to our meals throughout the day maybe heavily affect our dealing with what we think of as Viking Age food. And there's a question here about snacks. Was there a concept of snacks? And that made me think, what about dessert? How are they? Did they think of anything like dessert? We're always looking at honey, and what can we do with honey? We have to make a dessert because we're so used to dessert. And they had to have cream, and then they had cold weather, so they could make ice cream, right? You just start trying to rationalize your modern needs. But yeah. So anyway, the question about what you're seeing in different museum and festival settings for Viking food presentation.
I think it varies a lot. There has for a long time been a general tendency that museums don't take either food nor clothing seriously. So they do a shoddy job on each of them, actually. But I think with increased interest in cooking and food in general, and also an increased focus on finding out about the foods in archaeological digs and so on, that it's started to change a little, but you still have these ideas that modern traditional food equals Viking Age food. And also you have this tendency to want anything. It's like this craving for Viking Age food to be as similar to our expectations as possible. Like you would add exotic spices that weren't available till some centuries later on, as you mentioned, desserts and sweets and so on. But at the same time, especially among reenactors, I think there's a growing and genuine interest in trying to do this as faithfully as possible. And I really like how the question is phrased. Do they have a concept of? That's a very, very important way of thinking, because we are so used to using our own context and our own concepts as a starting point. But I think that's changing.
Yeah, I think so too. But well, there still is this large kind of bacon cravings in Viking crowds. But yes, but also, well, something because I can be very well, this is the Viking food. But if you're looking at reenactors, that's a whole different part than museums. Museums do tend to cater to what their expected audience too much. Reenactors, I would say, if you don't claim to do museum work, if you don't claim to do museum food, then you can do whatever you want to for food. It depends on what you're trying to display. I don't want to say that you can't eat something sweet, make a dessert in a reenactment camp, unless you say that this was what they were eating during the Viking Age. Dessert, by the way, when you start serving desserts, it's not until the Renaissance. You start serving sweet dishes beforehand, but a separate dessert is something that starts to separate from the main dish during the Renaissance. It's sort of a separate table, separate serving.
Is that when we start to see the forks being used instead of just spoon and knife?
Yeah, more or less. This fork starts being used mainly for sort of sticky fruits. Sticky and juicy fruits which you don't want to soil yourself with. But yes, it's more or less, that's when you start using forks as a implement for eating.
Right. I mentioned that before we began the broadcast. If they use spits, which is in some cases it looks like a giant fork. Why not? Why aren't we seeing forks from iron bindings? And
because it's not part of. I mean, this is the thing. You have to start with the idea of using it as a fork for eating. If what you do is a large giant fork for spit roasting something, it's not obvious that you can use it for eating.
And also, most of the food would be cooked. The food would very often be porridge, and whatever foods would be added to the porridge, you would eat it with your fingers, or you would put it in the porridge and you could still eat it with a spoon.
And it will be
Right.
cut up. It will be small pieces. It will not be the large piece of meat that you see in movies. So the large, juicy piece of meat that's sort of as big as your face, that's not really a thing.
Right. I think that the idea of having a pot is it should be everywhere, shouldn't it? At these demonstrations,
I mean,
the
a
pot
pot.
the pot to cook in.
Yeah,
Definitely.
definitely. And depends on where you're sort of displaying. If it's most places, if you can afford it, if it's a middle class almost, I would say it's soapstone vessel. Soapstone pot would be the most excellent thing. In Norway, I would say that would be the most common, since you don't really find that much pottery there. Or do we, Kari?
No, pottery disappears way before the Viking
Yeah.
Age.
So pottery.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, so pottery wasn't really used. Soapstone, on the other hand, it's exported to most of Scandinavia. You find it down in England, and it is a really excellent material. Large iron cauldrons, which we often see in museums and reenactment environments, would be the luxury cooking. Would be, and mainly for cooking meat, I would say. That's my interpretation. That you use large cauldrons to cook a lot of meat. Perhaps you can cook other things in bags together with the meat, but you don't want anything to stick, anything that's too acidic.
That brings up a good point with modern production and the cost of these things. Maybe why, if soapstone was so popular, but the access to it today, and especially someone to craft it, is really difficult versus production of these iron pots, which are relatively easily available on the market through sheet metal and some riveting. So
Exactly, you don't have to hammer the iron into sheets yourself with your hand,
right.
or hammer.
Yes, I think also a lot of cooking would happen in wooden tubs, like half barrels and things like
Yeah.
that. Because even though soapstone is available and so on, they can only get as big as that, and they will still be much more expensive. And you can cook in wooden tubs or any wooden container using hot stones. And you find a lot of fire-cracked stones in any archaeological context. Almost.
Yeah, the cooking stones is still something I need to try. That's of
it's
course
a different way of cooking, and it's better if you're not boiling things but simmering things. And that's also something you can say about cooking techniques during the Viking Age and medieval period. Things would more often be simmered than boiled.
Okay.
Because you can do it, you cook it for a long time, and making beer as well as simmering is far better method, and it requires more energy to start boiling something.
Boy, we have so many good questions off on the side here. But one of these was one that we were going to get through anyway, and that also has to do with the other material culture at the demonstration site. Cups, serving utensils, bowls, these kinds of things, and the different materials, and which would be more or less common. You know, what's maybe overrepresented versus what should be. You have your wood vessels. You have your horn. It's almost all on a lot of camps, and then of course the ceramics. So, right, and then the beakers.
Yeah.
Well, you can save the beakers and the horns for fancy, high-class social locations. They would not be in everyday use. As particularly the glasses would be something that only stinking rich people owned. Ordinary people would not own them. And as for the ceramics, it would depend a lot on what part of Scandinavia or the Viking world you wanted to portray. If it's down south in Denmark or the south of Sweden, then it's all right. But if you want to portray something from northern Scandinavia, there wasn't all that much pottery at all. There was a few imports, but that was mostly bigger pots, and they were found in environments like Kaifang, which is some place where a lot of artisans were collected to produce high-class stuff for some ruler. It would not be something that people in general would own.
No, I would say so. Yes, drinking from wooden cups, and eating from wooden bowls would probably be the most common. We see a decline in pottery in all over Scandinavia during the Viking Age. So this seems to be much more of a wood culture. And I would say for the horns, yes, you say it's upper class, and it's usually when you have the description of feasts, you don't drink by yourself. You share your horn with other people. You share your drinking vessel with other people, which would mean that you should probably not go carrying around your own horn for the feast. Although I know people are sharing quite a lot of mead and beer during festivals, so yes.
I can't remember where it was. I was reading about the glass beakers, and that the edge was beat up and worn, and that
Because it puts
they were
upside
thinking
down.
that it was held up. When it's done, it's upside down.
Yeah, that could be.
And so perhaps there weren't these holders that seem so
No, that's
conjectural.
no. There's no find of holders, so I think it's more likely that you were, and quite often that might be the horn that's described in the sagas. So you share the horn, the horn-shaped drink, and you fill it up as much as you should drink during the toast, and then you put it down.
I don't know if it's true, but the spiral holders are said to be inspired by Swedish car industry. Anyways, that's they're new. We invented them. They didn't exist back then.
Is regarding the ceramics, I have a comment or question here from Renee. When doing research into period correct pottery, it's suggested that the lack of lots of thrown pottery could be that households were making their own hand-built pots using a pinch pot or coil method and firing that in their home hearth.
Well,
no. There were a lot of back when it was still in use. There was a lot of really fancy, high-class drinking vessels made not by being thrown, but by making these coils and pinching them together. There was for a while even an industry doing that, but they were all intended for the tables of the high and rich. So no.
Well, of course, the Scandinavian, the Swedish pottery at the time is quite coarse and bad. It's if you don't look at the imported ones, so that might be what you're referring to, because the local pottery, but it's not that much fun. Let's say that's it's difficult to say. But I mean, the Swedish pottery at the time, it's really coarse. It's really.
The Viking Age pottery in Norway is non-existent. I was referring to the last parts of the migration era. That was kind of the last heyday of ceramics in northern Scandinavia, and it was exclusively used as drinking vessels, and they were very flash and fancy, but they were not thrown.
No, that's true. It's not thrown, and were fancy as well in Sweden, the migration period pottery. What you do get, the fancier pottery you get in Sweden during the Viking Age is probably from the Slavonic areas. So it's imported pottery. The really fancy ones are from the Frisian tin and silver decorated pottery.
All right. I think that answers that.
And I have a book. If you can see it.
Oh,
Let's see.
bit there.
This
Yeah.
one. You can find this for free if you
Oh.
search for it, and it does have an article on pottery in Scandinavia and
Okay.
why the decline occurred, and it's quite good.
Well, I think if we look at, is there anything else we want to talk about what to avoid at a?
Well, yes. The one thing you should avoid if we're talking about cooking utensils, eating utensils, is the pricker.
The pricker.
The small wooden stick that people sometimes use in medieval reenactment
Yeah.
context, or metal stick, which people use because they need to have something that works as a fork.
Mm-hmm. Like a cloak pin.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's and that is because if you're serving food in the way we serve food today, if you serve food as a whole piece of meat with your carbohydrates on the side, then you need something to pin the meat down when you cut it.
Right.
So I think it's a sort of a backwards reinvention of something.
It's a unifork or something.
Yes.
And even when it gets down to your knife and your spoon, it's quick, at least from what I got into this a decade ago, was okay, I should have a wooden spoon and I should have a knife. But you can get so much more specific than that. And I think it was at
Yeah.
Ancestors Footsteps when Nina Eckloff was there and she said, "Oh, I think the spoons need some work, the shape of the spoons." I thought, oh yeah, I guess just having a wooden spoon's not good enough. It's got,
No.
got to have the right contours and length. And
Well, spoons usually found in Sweden, at least, are a bit more shovel-like. So small shovels.
right,
They're
I had this
faced with porridge.
Yes, good
this was
with
the
porridge.
example I had there, and she said, no, it needs a much more severe curve. I thought, yeah,
All
okay.
right. That's perhaps, but the thing I would say it's too hollow.
Mm-hmm. We were talking about a specific Burka example.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's so quick to go into the thrift store here and get an exotic hardwood wood cup or spoon and just make that work. But I think we all appreciate seeing the extra effort put in for advancing your kit in any way you can, when you can.
Yeah, that's all. It's all a question about context as well. I mean, when you're starting, I mean, you shouldn't expect people to, or blame people if they can't get 100% Birka copies when you start. If you start an interest in food, start by try to explore the tastes, the ingredients,
Mm.
and then you sort of level up.
I think also you should think about which context do you want to try out or portray. Hedeby in the south of Denmark, virtually in Germany, is very different from the north of Norway, for instance.
Yes.
Are you stinking rich? Are you a traveler? And so on. So context, pick a context. And of course, you need to compromise, and you should not try and hide your compromises. I think you should demonstrate your compromises and explain why you made them.
I think we see that with when you have an event site and you're not allowed to dig a fire pit.
Yeah,
we see so many above ground examples.
Yeah, that's one thing, but also with the food. Like if you can't get hare, you might get a rabbit instead, and then you have to explain that it should
be. Or you can't get hold of horse meat.
Yeah, we do. I would like to touch on the horse meat thing because you have that great reference about And someone did ask if how we should treat saga references for food things.
Oh.
Should we talk about horse meat now?
Well, we can talk about. We can combine both. Talk about food and religion, and talk about the saga references.
All right, let's do that.
Well, my take on saga references is you can use them when food is carrying. Well, you have to look at it. Is it medieval? Doesn't seem to be a medieval saga, but also if the food is carrying a central part in the story. If food is just sort of decoration, then it might be more difficult to use it. But if it's used to explain the whole events, then it's more difficult to change in time. So you have to be careful when using the saga as an inspiration. But for instance, when we talk about food and religion, I've used this saga about a Christian king who's being served horse meat during a feast, and he's being served this at a bloat, and it is a religious meal, and he's being served, and he's refusing to eat the horse meat because horse meat is considered to be heathen. So he, being the king, he should sort of sanctify it, and he refuses, and then he comes up with the compromise of doing what everyone else should think is a Thor sign, but in reality is a cross. And not even sure if the Thor sign was a thing in that sense. But yes, the horse meat there gives us an idea of its religious use. And also perhaps on how to cook it, that it's boiled rather than spit roasted. And you find the idea of eating horse meat in several sagas, several laws. So you find collaborating into the idea that, horse meat was part of a religious meal. And I would say that is also one of the main taboos, but a positive taboo. You don't really eat horse meat for fun. You eat it for a purpose. You eat it when there is a religious meal. That's why it's so taboo afterwards.
All right.
Kari, do you have any?
No, I'm just thinking about cooking pits. Cooking pits are mainly used before the Viking Age. It's still used in a few religious contexts, but it's not common anymore. But in cooking pits from before the Viking Age, very often they find some horse teeth. They're not cooked. They have not been in the fire, so it's put there intentionally. And they think maybe it's supposed to symbolize the sacrifice of the horse or something. So this thing that horses are sacrificial animals, they're not food, goes way back. And horses are magic. You can eat the flesh, and as long as you sacrifice at least some of the blood, the skin, the hooves, the head, the horse will arrive alive and in one piece at the gods. So it's a kind of sacrificial economy, but it's not food. You don't eat horse flesh because you're hungry. There are no stories of anyone eating horses because they're hungry.
I'll keep that in mind next time I see some horse meat for sale, which I've only seen it available in Scandinavia. But some of the viewers here commenting that it's still illegal in some states, but it's getting more relaxed on the laws in other states like Oregon. So we'll see. I know a breeder in our area that is okay with it. Well, my video froze here, but you can still hear me, correct? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad I didn't have too disgusting of a facial expression when that froze. We'll see if that comes back in. If not, I will reconnect my camera. Yeah. But I did want to move on to another bullet point of yours, Daniel, or whichever of you created this here, which was food from the wilderness out in the wild and versus the cultivated areas. And I think sometimes maybe people think the majority of the meat was hunted, and that Vikings lived so much off of wild game, and and that I know that might be the first thought to come into my own head, but what's the story with wilderness versus cultivated?
Well, that's a rather big question. Do you want to start, Kari, or should I?
Yeah, I can start. I think I'll just start with discussing hunting versus trapping a little bit, because those are very different things.
Yes.
Hunting is something aristocrats do for sports. It's to practice war when there is no war, and to get good at riding and shooting and so on and so forth. But whilst trapping is to get food. If you, for instance, when there is a lot of geese, it's much more efficient to have a trap and catch them than try and shoot them. It's difficult to decide where they will land, and they will all disappear when you start shooting them. But if you have a bird trap, they will think it's safe, and more birds will land and get caught. And you can send off your old man and your kids to go and kill and pick up the birds.
So it's more or less like harvesting.
Yes, much more harvesting. And I think that's the main way people got game. Like we have all these traps in the mountains for reindeer. We know that the antler was something that was shipped off to Europe because it was a vastly sought after commodity, but you'd get a lot of meat as well. And also there are traps on or traps for catching seabirds. You can of course use the feathers as well, but trapping is for food. So I think that's a very important distinction to make.
Yeah, I think that sounds fair, because what I see often is that you don't find that much food from the wild. You don't find much bones from the, wild animals in the settlements. You don't, and especially when it comes to gathering, you don't find a lot of exotic sort of wild, forest berries, forest fruits, mushrooms. You don't find at all, and even seafood is very scarce, or no finds at all. That's sort of in a food context. So we have this. Well, not it is different between different sites, and that's where we talk about context. But yeah, so there seems to be an idea that you don't really go out in the forest and gather things. In Anglo-Saxon England, it was even considered that if you go to the forest and gather nuts and berries and acorns, and if you're a pregnant woman doing this, your children will turn out stupid. And that is probably because you're on the poorest strata. And why is this? Why would people avoid gathering in that sense? Well, you find it in some places. You find it in trading sites. There you can find more fruits and berries and nuts than you find in, for instance, a large farm. And I think one part is that it's an identification. You see yourself as a farmer, or as someone who's living off the cultivated land. So harvesting fish, harvesting seabirds is one thing, but go out hunting is something completely different. Go out picking berries, that's also a bit different. And I think sorry?
I'm thinking one of the really important reasons why people would not go out in the woods to pick stuff is just that there isn't all that much to pick in the woods. It's around the farm where you can find the majority of edible plants. And also people would have to have some kind of economy in this. Like, there is no point in picking shitloads of berries if you can't use them for anything, because they will go bad. And you have to eat like several buckets full in order to get enough energy to cover your daily needs. So they will not be useful. But berries and things will probably be picked on the go because they taste nice, and by poor people because they were hungry. But they would not be worthwhile using a lot of time on picking. And I think that's them as well.
Unless you pick it on the way, as you say, and you find it in areas where it's more common, in areas where, for instance, you have in farms where you have the grazing of sheep or cattle coincide with the berries. For instance, Lofoten, you find lots of berries in the stable area. But I think the main reason, one of the reasons for this happening, is the idea of the sort of, as I said, the idea of gathering is bad. Gathering is something you do when you're poor, when you're starving, and you only have to go back like but a few hundred years earlier. There's lots more evidence coming up for that now. A few hundred years earlier, we had a large famine in Europe. It was a huge famine going through all of Europe. It sort of coincided with the Dark Ages. And you have this famine, people will go out gathering. That's happening in every famine. It's described how you start using seaweed, you're using grass, you're using sawdust, you're using dead people. You mix everything in the food, depending on how severe the famine is. So when you're not doing, when there's not a famine, you will not go out and gather famine food. So I think this is living on still in the Viking Age as a very sort of living memory of what is high status food, what is food that we supposed to eat, and what food you should avoid because it's not really part of it is part of being poor, being on the bottom rung of society.
All right. There's so much talk about food. We should include some talk about drink.
Oh yeah.
True.
And are they chugging mead? Are they chugging ale? Are they sipping wine? Are they enjoying fresh milk?
They are
Depends on who you are.
way.
Yeah. You go ahead with the milk.
Yeah, you would try and not drink water, not because it would be poisonous or dirty or anything, but simply because it comes out of the ground. It's natural. It's not part of the human realm. So you would only drink that if you had to. That's that tradition lasted till, I don't know, a century ago or something. You would ideally not drink pure water. You would mix it with something, and what you would mix it with would be whey. Not sweet whey, but the Serra variety. And you would also drink cultured milk. And you would actually drink beer, but it would be more expensive. So maybe beer, ale, would be more expensive. Yes. So you would mainly save your barley that was suitable for making beer for occasions. You would not make beer just like to have something to drink on an everyday basis. But I'm thinking that after you had some kind of occasion where you needed beer, because you needed beer for lots of occasions, otherwise you could not really have on occasion, you could use the same malt and make a much weaker beer. So pre-occasion, you would probably drink some weak beer.
Yeah, that's. I mean, this lives on in the medieval period. You have different classes of beer.
Mm.
So from the rich one, which is quite malty, to the weak beers that are sort of done using the remains of brewing. You also have the you even mix the beer later on, at least from medieval period up to last century. You mix the weak beer with sour milk. That's you have some traditions of that. So that would be part of everyday drinks. But beer, yeah, well, that depends on. But I think beer as well is part of your identity. You make beer also to show who you are. So not being able to serve beer would probably be bad for your reputation.
Is there? It sounds like beer or ale was pretty widespread. Are wine and mead more of a regional thing, or where do they fall on the line of common beverages?
Well, I would say mead is more regional thing, sort of more of the Baltic area. But yes, mead and wine were upper class things.
I suspect that mead was pretty much like horseflesh. It wasn't a drink as such. It was something very ritual. I guess only the most important guests would actually get a sip because it would be expensive imports. We don't know if it was import it just as mead, or if maybe they imported honey and made mead themselves. But I think either way, the people who produce the honey would try and get as much profits out of it. So selling off ready-made mead would be a much more economic idea.
Although it's, yeah.
And also the people importing it would want to keep it exclusive. So it would be a high status thing that they could embellish their own status with, make themselves more important.
I mean, wine was more or less the same. It wasn't an import. It was expensive. It was. We do know that it's been imported. Wine's been imported since the Roman Iron Age. So, but that would be an upper class, unless you're the sort of king of gods. If you're Odin, then you can chug wine. Well, that's what it says in this in the Edda. He's only drinking wine, nothing else.
Yeah, he doesn't even eat.
No, so he's an old. Well, he's an old wino.
Yeah, and that says something about how exclusive wine would be if it was the only thing good enough for the king of the gods to drink.
But then again, you find it you can find this, and that's the sort of the interesting part about the trading sites. You can find it sometimes in trading sites. It's described in the description of Ansgar that an old woman who's he's sort of christening Birka, and it's described as an old woman in Birka who wanted to get the last rites when there was no priest there, sent her servant out to buy wine. So it might be available in the trading sites. But then again, yes, it would be upper class. It's not something for... And I think, going back to mead, I would say that mead or honey is probably one of the things that were imported together with the pottery, with the high-end Slavonic pottery. And the Slavonic areas would have been the main exporter of honey.
Okay. We did have a comment saying, of course they drink water.
Yeah.
Whenever they were on the move, they could not drag along their beer or other manufactured liquids. Yeah. And it reminds me of my first time going to Scandinavia in 1999, when we were led to a stream in the woods and told it was safe. So dip your cup in and start drinking. And I thought, well, maybe for some things there just isn't much evidence to support whether they did it or not. How would we know if someone stuck their head in a fresh stream? Yeah.
Well, yes, I think I would say that I do disagree a bit about this notion of the danger of water coming out from the ground. But there is a difference between water from a well and water from a stream, to start with. But then we have the traveling part. You don't really go traveling, well, most times, you don't just go traveling in the woods for no reason. You don't take a large tour. So when you go traveling, you probably would have leather bags with whey or some other drinks with you. You don't just go for a walk. If you're taking a boat, you probably will have a place for storing the drinks. If you're traveling, usually you would travel from farm to farm. You don't travel to the wilderness so much. And if you travel from farm to farm, then there's not really the same need to bring water as to drink water from the streams. But of course, I don't say that they don't. I wouldn't agree that they don't drink it, and I don't think that was Kari said either.
No, not at all. But only when there was no choice, when it was the only thing you had. And an interesting thing about whey, you can actually cook it so much it becomes solid, and you can dissolve it in water again. And we know this from historical records that it was done until quite recently. So you could keep it as a solid bar, and then you could cut off bits and mix it with water to make a nutritious drink. And it doesn't weigh that much.
I wanted to get towards the end of we're just about to 1 hour here. And the last section of what we know we wanted to discuss for sure was the regional and local differences. and I think particularly, how did the traveling into other parts of Europe change the food culture? What is the evidence showing? Did a new kind of grain become the mark of what the Viking Age Scandinavians preferred to eat, or were evidence of pig consumption pushing beef consumption out of the way, or this kind of thing?
Well, you do have differences in time for instance, pig consumption. But I think that's a bit different. We don't find anything of spices or anything like that. Although wine and meat, for instance, that are foreign influences. In Hedeby, you find quite a lot of millet, and that could be also an influence from the continent. But it is difficult. It is very difficult to say to see very obvious influences in the early part. So the influences come when you start changing society towards what we call the medieval Scandinavia. That's when you start changing a lot of other ideas. And then we see quite a lot of food changes.
Now there is one food change. It doesn't have to do with imports, but it has to do with sailing ships. Now we know that sailing ships began before the Viking Age. They started developing Viking ships in the Vendel time, or whatever it's called in English. And of course they would have had a lot of sheep, because you need a lot of wool for your clothing, and also sheep's milk is much more useful than goats or cow's milk. But when you have sailing ships, you need sails, so there would have been an explosion in the amount of sheep. So people would have been eating more and more sheep, because the sheep population would be steadily increasing. Doesn't have to do with imports, but I think that's an important takeaway from the Viking Age.
Yes, and well, you find also one thing that is changing is, but that would be in the trading places, that you can find that people are eating more pigs over time, because when you live in close quarters, you use pigs as
a renovation.
Yes, you throw your yes, you reuse things using the pig.
Mm-hmm.
You serve them everything, and they clean out. Yes, most stuff.
Four-legged garbage can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you will have a rise in the use of pigs, which is interesting because pigs have both a very high and low end status due to this.
I see. That was my phone. Did you hear that?
No? Okay.
Yeah, well, that reminds me, we did talk about the book at the beginning, and somebody just mentioned it again. An early meal. There's been a lot of questions about ingredients and sources, and there's a great list of them in the plant remains found in archaeological sites in the back, so you can look up different ingredients there. But it brings up, speaking of ingredients, a segue to one question I mentioned I wanted to get to, which was what's new with discoveries in Viking Age Foodways since the publication of the book, or what's new and exciting recently otherwise. And I think the word was hops.
Yeah, hops is one thing. That's there's a Swedish researcher, Jens Heimdall, who's been looking into hops in Scandinavia from the Viking Age and onwards, and he can see that hops been more prevalent than we previously thought.
Is it just in beverage or food as
well?
well?
That's the interpretation, that it has been used for beers. So you have part of Scandinavia which will be using hops, and other parts using Gale. Well, not exclusively, but more like that. You can see sort of a streak of hop using that starts already in the Viking Age, which is a bit contrary to what I've written before, and so it's an interesting subject. Another thing that's been found is in Uppåkra. I think they found quite a lot of parsley,
but not from the Viking Age.
Yes, from the Viking. No, it's earlier. It's migration period.
Okay.
Well, I'm
But there are other interesting finds from Uppåkra, but it's also earlier. I don't think there are any finds from the Viking Age.
No, well, not. I don't think so. But I'm not entirely sure about that anymore. Since. So, any other finds? Do you have anything, Kari, that's pops up?
There's this discussion about onions and leek.
Yes.
Confusing thing is that in Scandinavian languages there isn't a word that divides between onions and leek. We use the same word. So when you read about people eating onions or leek in the sagas, we can't really know what it is. There are a few wild ones like ramson and chives and things like that. But there are also theories that there is this type of onion which is a bit like shallot, which is called nowadays potato onion, that might be used. But there are no finds. It's only speculation. But
well, yes, there is a probable find, but it's also earlier than Viking Age. It's from Helland. So there's one find from one of the sort of migration period of a burnt leek or onion. I think that might have been a potato.
Are you thinking about the massacre place? I can't remember what it's called,
Yes.
or something. Oh, that's earlier. They think it's
that's earlier.
It's a Roman import. They don't think it's been locally grown.
Could be, yeah. So I'm not sure what James.
That's what the report I've read.
All right.
At least.
But then there is a find that's also after the book is, I think, the Scoplodasium, the sort of beach leek in Bornholm.
Something that grows locally in places.
Yeah. Yes, and that was found in a small bronze vessel with some linen.
What this leads me to another thought I had, and that is what I asked this in the leather discussion as well. And what are you hoping that will show up soon in discoveries? What have you been wanting to eat or use for implements or cookware that you think might be out there? There's just no evidence for it yet, so you're just anxious. I'm waiting for him to find a fork or or
orange carrots.
I don't know. Yeah. So
an abandoned cooking pit, abandoned in use, would have been quite interesting.
Yeah.
I'm hoping they will find someone's travel food in some glacier somewhere.
Yeah, that's true.
That would be brilliant.
And yes, definitely what I want to see finds of is more latrines.
Yeah, I think the finding something on a parallel level of the Mastermere tool chest, but with foodways implements would be a fantastic addition to our understanding.
Yeah, both kitchenware and you have Oseberg ship that sort of gives it is a bit the same.
Yeah, but it would be nice if we can kind of. I don't think we need to find more tools and implements. It would be nice naturally, but what we do need to find is more about plants and how the food was actually used, like burnt food and things like that can be analyzed and can tell us something about what was in the pot.
Yes, more. Soapstone pots with burnt remains.
In it, yeah.
All right. Well, let's cross our fingers for burnt remains. I think that that puts us at 1 hour and 9 minutes, and there are lots of unanswered questions in the sidebar here. But this broadcast will stay up on Viking Connection, and I think it should be able to be shared beyond just the Viking Connection Facebook page. So, Daniel and Kari, I hope you can hop in here and answer some of these questions at your leisure. I know it's pretty late over there in Scandinavia right now.
Yeah,
and so I wanted to thank everybody for participating. I sort of kept a look at the count here as we went along, but I think we got up to around 190 active viewers at one point. We're at 157 right now, and that is very impressive. So I want to thank you all for participating in that. And next month, December, we'll be talking about Viking Age art. And I can't post the StreamYard link until 1 week away from that discussion. But that'll be, when is that? December 6th? Yeah, December 6th. We'll talk about Viking art. So,
and who are the guests?
Well, I have one down, Luciano, who's blanking on his last name at the moment, but I may add one in addition to him, and we can talk about the chronology of a change of Viking art styles throughout the period, and I think it'll be fun, especially for anybody crafting and creating these days. So tune in if you want to learn how to carve a Gokstead head in your brisket. No, I don't know. I don't know if I can delve into art and foodways as combining. Although it's a nice idea for an event sometime. We can discuss.
We should really do that.
We did that in grad school. We had a contest with Wonder Bread and making sculptures out of Wonder Bread.
What did you say, Kari?
I was just thinking that it doesn't seem like there was that much effort put into the way what you put on the table were looking, but there was a lot of emphasis on cooking ware. The fancy iron pots.
A twisting of...
Although,
all those...
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was done.
All right. In Rikstula, though, it is described that you have a nice linen cloth, and you have silverware and goldware, and you have the roasted birds and wine in beakers. So there it is sort of a presentation, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's lots of aesthetics to consider, especially with the ironwork for cooking implements, and just some nice tapering and turns and twists of hooks and handles, but also some of the woodwork with some decorative elements in there too.
I think some of the food would have some aesthetics to it. I mean, of course, boiled food is more difficult to create a nice aesthetics to. But still, I think there would have been, for a really upper class feast, you would probably have some aesthetics, but it's very difficult to say because it's never described. There's nothing written down about that. So
there probably would have been some expectations as to what the food should look like and how it should be presented.
Exactly. So that's today.
Yeah. I mean, just one trencher comes to mind from it's a Norwegian finding, but the ends of the trencher have just those very common zigzag shapes.
And also, for instance, if you're drinking from a glass beaker, the sort of horn-shaped glass beaker you showed earlier, then the color of the drink is important.
Oh, right. Yeah. This was a funny story. This was a request. I showed a picture of the original. I said, can you make just a thin blue rim around the top? And it came back with this spiral. I thought, all right, I'll keep looking. But
yes, if you have a sort of clear glass, then it could be important the color of the drink as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
In my experience, glasses like that look fantastic with red wine and a sparkling fire.
Exactly, because you get
fire, it looks so exotic and gleaming and
So if you have a dark beer or a dark mead, which also be almost red to the tone, then you get a nice view as well. So yeah.
Well, we've turned to alcohol.
And we should by the end of the sitting.
Well, thank you both again. I'll end the broadcast here. I think I'll stay on with Daniel and Kari for a minute just to follow up our discussion. But once again, thank you to everyone who joined us, and I think you can continue to ask questions in the comment bar, and hopefully we'll get to all of them as the broadcast stays up. All right, thank you. Any last words from Daniel, Kari?
Well, yes. Well, it'll probably be around in the future again. We're talking about doing something similar again by ourselves and inviting other food people.
Excellent.
And also, I have a Viking Age food group on Facebook that you can look up and see what I post and post questions to yourself.
Yeah, and I have this culinary archaeology page where I sort of update what I'm doing. And I'm currently working on a medieval cookbook, Danish 13th century.
Excellent.
Okay, that's some short commercial of ourselves.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.